By the final months of 1918, World War I had reached a point of exhaustion that few had imagined possible when the conflict began 4 years earlier. What had started as a regional crisis had grown into a global war that reshaped continents, destroyed empires, and altered the lives of millions. The scale of destruction was unprecedented, and by this stage, victory was no longer defined by conquest, but by endurance. Nations were no longer fighting to gain ground alone, but to avoid collapse. The year 1918 began with a final gamble by Germany. With Russia out of the war following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, German commanders believed they had a narrow window of opportunity. Troops were transferred from the Eastern Front to the West, and enormous resources were committed to one last offensive designed to break Allied resistance before American forces could fully deploy. This became known as the Spring Offensive. Initially, the attacks achieved significant breakthroughs. German forces advanced rapidly, using new infiltration tactics that bypassed strongpoints and struck deep behind Allied lines. For the first time in years, the static trench warfare of the Western Front seemed to give way to movement. Paris once again appeared threatened, and Allied leaders feared a war might still be lost. But the success was short-lived. German losses were catastrophic, and the advances could not be sustained. Supply lines failed to keep pace with the troops, and units became exhausted. Crucially, Germany had no strategic reserves left to exploit these gains. Every casualty weakened an army that was already stretched to its limits. In contrast, the Allies were growing stronger. The unification of command under General Ferdinand Foch allowed for coordinated responses across the front. Most importantly, the United States was now fully committed. American troops arrived in increasing numbers, bringing fresh manpower, industrial strength, and renewed confidence. While inexperienced, these soldiers represented something Germany could no longer match, an almost unlimited capacity to continue the war. By the summer of 1918, the balance had shifted decisively. The Allied counteroffensive began with a series of attacks that would later be known collectively as the 100 Days Offensive. Using combined arms tactics, including infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft, the Allies pushed German forces back along the entire front. One defensive line after another collapsed. For German soldiers, the situation became increasingly hopeless. Morale deteriorated rapidly as rumors of defeat spread. Many had already endured years of trench warfare under horrific conditions, and now they faced constant retreat with no clear objective. Desertions increased, and units struggled to maintain discipline. Meanwhile, the war effort at home was unraveling. The Allied naval blockade had severely weakened Germany's economy. Food shortages became widespread, leading to malnutrition and disease among civilians. Industrial output declined, and public confidence in the government eroded. Strikes and protests spread through major cities, reflecting a population exhausted by sacrifice and loss. Germany's allies were in no position to provide support. Bulgaria was the first to collapse, signing an armistice in September 1918. The Ottoman Empire soon followed, its forces unable to defend vast territories any longer. Austria-Hungary, plagued by ethnic divisions and military defeat, disintegrated rapidly. By October, it too sought peace. With its allies gone and its military in retreat, Germany faced the reality of defeat. Political leaders recognized that continuing the war would only lead to revolution and total collapse. In early October, the German government requested an armistice, appealing directly to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points as the basis for peace. These points promised a new international order built on self-determination, open diplomacy, and collective security. For many Germans, they represented hope for a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. However, the Allies had little interest in compromise. Their terms became increasingly strict as Germany's position weakened. As negotiations dragged on, fighting continued along the front. German forces retreated steadily, abandoning positions they had defended for years. Railways, artillery, and supply depots were left behind. The sense of inevitability became overwhelming. Inside Germany, events moved quickly. In early November, mutinies erupted within the Navy as sailors refused to carry out orders for what they believed would be a suicidal final battle. These uprisings spread, inspiring workers and soldiers across the country to form councils and demand political change. The authority of the monarchy collapsed almost overnight. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne and fled into exile in the Netherlands. The German Empire, which had existed for less than 50 years, came to an abrupt end. A new civilian government was formed, tasked with securing peace and preventing further chaos. 2 days later, German representatives arrived in the forest of Compiègne, where they met Allied officials in a railway carriage. The terms presented to them were harsh but clear. Germany was required to cease hostilities immediately, withdraw from occupied territories, surrender large quantities of weapons, and accept Allied occupation of key areas. In the early hours of November 11, 1918, the Armistice was signed. It came into effect at 11 o'clock in the morning. Across the Western Front, soldiers waited anxiously as the final minutes passed. When the guns finally fell silent, many struggled to comprehend that the war was truly over. The reaction varied widely. Some soldiers celebrated openly, while others remained cautious, uncertain whether the ceasefire would hold. For many, the silence felt unnatural after years of constant bombardment. Civilians across Europe poured into the streets, celebrating the end of the fighting with flags, music, and spontaneous gatherings. Yet beneath the celebrations lay profound grief. The war had claimed millions of lives and left countless families shattered. Entire communities had lost their young men, and survivors returned home physically and psychologically scarred. The scale of loss was impossible to fully grasp. The aftermath of the war reshaped the world. Old empires vanished, replaced by new nations whose borders often ignored ethnic and cultural realities. Political instability spread across Europe, fueled by economic hardship and unresolved tensions. While the Armistice ended the fighting, it did not bring true peace. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, formalized the end of the war between the Allies and Germany. Its terms imposed severe penalties, including territorial losses, military restrictions, and heavy reparations. While intended to prevent future conflict, the treaty instead fostered resentment and economic hardship, particularly in Germany. The end of World War I marked a profound turning point in modern history, not only because the fighting had stopped, but because the nature of warfare itself had been permanently transformed. The conflict demonstrated that war had become industrialized, mechanized, and total in a way never seen before. Machines, mass production, and modern technology dictated the pace and scale of destruction. Artillery, machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and aircraft turned battlefields into killing zones, while the traditional ideas of honor and maneuver that had once defined warfare were rendered obsolete. Civilians were no longer distant observers of conflict. Entire societies were drawn into the war effort, whether through factory labor, rationing, propaganda, or direct exposure to violence. Cities were bombed, food shortages became widespread, and families lived under constant uncertainty. The distinction between the front lines and the home front largely disappeared, creating a new reality in which war reshaped everyday life far from the trenches. The legacy of the war extended far beyond the Armistice of 1918. Politically, it shattered empires and redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. New nations emerged from the ruins of old regimes, often burdened with unstable borders and unresolved ethnic tensions. The collapse of traditional authority structures created power vacuums that fueled revolutions, most notably in Russia, and encouraged radical political movements elsewhere. These changes set the stage for decades of instability and conflict. Socially and psychologically, the impact of the war was equally profound. Millions of veterans returned home carrying physical wounds and invisible scars. What was later understood as shell shock left countless individuals struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. Entire communities mourned lost generations, and the collective grief reshaped culture, literature, and art. The optimism that had characterized much of the pre-war world was replaced by disillusionment and skepticism toward authority, progress, and war itself. Economically, the war left Europe exhausted. Nations faced enormous debts, destroyed infrastructure, and disrupted trade. Inflation and unemployment plagued many countries, contributing to social unrest and political extremism. The punitive economic terms imposed on Germany would later play a significant role in deepening resentment and instability, creating conditions that made another global conflict increasingly likely. The silence of November 11, 1918, did not erase the trauma of the previous 4 years. If you appreciate restored historical footage and stories like this, make sure to subscribe to History Safe. Your support helps keep these rare moments from the past alive and accessible. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with others who love history. Every interaction helps History Safe uncover, restore, and bring more forgotten footage back to life. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more incredible history.